In an earlier video, we talked about Maya's basic shaders, and Arnold, the Arnold renderer, can use these shaders, but in order to get the most out of Arnold, you probably want to use shaders written specifically for Arnold. So let's assign an Arnold shader to this sphere. Okay, so I'm going to go in rendering, I'll go up here, lighting, shading, assign new material. Okay, and this is, if I click here in Arnold, you can see these are the Arnold shaders. If you see AI, that means that's for the Arnold renderer specifically, right? So if you look at the names of these Arnold shaders, you probably notice that they seem to be more purpose-built. There's not like an equivalent Lambert, Arnold Lambert shader and Arnold Fong shader. Those, the Fong and Blinn and Lambert, those have been around for quite a while now. Those have been named after their creators. And if we assign like the AI standard surface, now that's a shader that's for surfaces, as you might imagine from the name. These newer parameters you might hear people refer to sometimes as being physically based. And that's because they more closely approximate what light actually naturally does. To see the effect of these parameters, let's pull up the Hypershade. When I click there, well, first of all, we want to make sure we're using the right renderer. So make sure up here, instead of saying hardware, you want to make sure it says Arnold. Then it's looking kind of dark right here. Let's change our exposure. This is like a lens shutter, right? So we can change the exposure. Let's try 1, and that's a little better. I think we'll get even better if we go up to 2. There, now we can get a better look of the material. So, of course, here we could change the color in this. That jumps out right away. Now we could change it to like light blue or whatever. And we could change the weight of that color. Now if we go all the way down, then the color has no weight. All the way up, it starts to kind of self-illuminate a little bit. So kind of a standard place to have it is somewhere between 0.7 or 0.8. Typically, it'll come in by default at 0.8. So, and then diffuse roughness, that's how rough the surface is. That's kind of obvious, I guess. Then metalness. Metalness has more to do with reflectivity. It's of course it works hand in hand with roughness. Like you could have a very rough metal, but a rough metal is still going to reflect more than a rough non-metal like wood. Right, doesn't really reflect anything. So metalness has to do mostly with how much it reflects. And then, okay, here specular. Specular, this really has to do with the highlights. So, of course, you could change here notice how I'm affecting really the highlight, or that little speck there. It goes from really sharp, right, to just really spread out to where it's not even there. So the roughness of the specular highlight. Okay, up here you do have certain presets. Now don't mix that up with here. The type of shader, right now we're the Arnold standard surface, right? If we go here, we could see, okay, there's our Blinn and Lambert and Fong. These literally change it to another shader. Okay, so these are not settings for this shader. These are ways of changing the shader to another shader. So, like this Blinn is the Maya Blinn, and this is the Maya Lambert. Okay, so this is changing what the whole shader is. Okay, but now that we're set to the standard surface shader, okay, the standard surface shader has presets. Okay, and right here are those presets, and it's off the screen, so it's hard to see. There's one down here that says skin. Okay, and so like we can change it to say replace or blend with the current shader, but we could say replace this to be a skin shader, right? And now this has got all the settings to make the standard surface look like skin. The most prominent being the subsurface scattering. Okay, right here, subsurface. And this is where light, as it says, goes below the surface and it bounces around under the surface and then comes back out. And that's what makes skin, look different. It doesn't, all the light doesn't just hit the top and bounce away. Some of it kind of soaks in deeper into the skin, bounces around under the skin, and then comes back out. Now I've updated my Arnold plugin for Maya just recently, and so I've got version 2.0, which uses Arnold's 5.0 rendering engine. So there have been quite a few changes, going from the 4 series to now the 5. And it used to be that they were organized a little different, right? So we'd go into shader, and here you'd find an AI skin shader and a bunch of others. And now they've kind of streamlined it a bit, I think. And so now there's the AI standard surface. It used to just say AI standard. And now within the standard surface, we have these presets, right? And so skin, it's off the screen, I know, but skin's down here. So half the game when you're learning about this stuff really is learning how it's all laid out, right? How people have organized it. So just keep in mind at this point that Maya, the Maya software renderer, has been around a lot longer than Arnold. And so it's going to use the more traditional, older shaders, right? Like the Phong and Blinn and those kinds. Arnold is kind of the new kid on the block, right? And so as a plugin, they're going to make a special effort to make sure that their renderer will work with Maya's shaders. But then Arnold really wants to use its own shaders written specifically for it. Okay, and so here's that list of shaders that will come with the Arnold plugin. And any rendering plugin is going to have a list of shaders like this, right? Mental Ray, it had its own quite long list of shaders specifically for it, and V-Ray does, and Octane, and Redshift, and there's quite a few renderers out there, and each of them are going to do their best to be compatible with the existing shaders, and they're each going to come with their own set of shaders that renderer prefers. And the way Arnold has organized its shaders, you can see each of them kind of has more of a purpose, right? And the standard surface is probably one you'd use a lot. It's, I'm sure, the most frequently used. And within it, you're going to have all the parameters to be able to approximate like the Phong and Blinn and those things. But your goal is not really going to be trying to approximate Phong or Blinn or Lambert, but to approximate real-world materials. Either that or a specific look that you're after. And in that sense, the newer shaders actually simplify that process, because you're not trying to start with, oh well, Phong has quite a shiny highlight and that kind of looks the most like this material, so let me start with a Phong and see if I can get it to look like plastic or whatever. Or, oh, Lambert, maybe I should start with that if I'm making wood, because there's no specular highlight in wood. When you begin texturing using a program like Substance Designer or Substance Painter, and if you're making assets for game engines like Unreal or Unity, one of the first questions you'll be confronted with is, do you want to use a specular workflow or a Metalness workflow? And the Metalness workflow is probably the more popular one. It's the newer one. And when people talk about physically based shading, they're kind of referring to the Metalness workflow. So these two channels, you can approximate most materials very closely with just these two channels, the way that they reflect light. The most commonly utilized channels these days, especially if you're exporting to a game engine or something, is going to be obviously color, obviously diffuse roughness, metalness, or a channel for a bump map or normal map. Okay, I'd like to make one more note about the Arnold standard surface shader. And that is, if you want to make an object transparent, there's other settings you have to remember. Let's create a glass material. So we'll give it transparency. Okay, so we'll just do a right click, right? And we'll say assign new material, and we'll choose the Arnold standard surface. Okay, and let's take a look at it up here. Whoop. And we want this to be a clear glass. So I'm first of all going to go to a preset. I'm going to go here to glass and say replace. Okay, you'll see, oh, it's turning this ugly black. What is going on? So we want to go to transmission, and maybe look at that. There, it's the weight of the colors, right? But actually the first thing we really want to do is go into the geometry, and there we're going to have a setting for opacity, and we'll give it some opacity there. Maybe make it, I don't know, about that much maybe. And we can change now, you know, what do we want our weight for our specular or for our other things. Maybe we want a little more opacity. Or less, I mean. Okay, so we have a kind of glass material, right? Well, if we try to render that, it's not going to actually show up clear yet, or it's going to show up opaque. Now, oddly enough, our hardware renderer is accepting that. It understands that that is transparent, because see, you can see right through that. But if we go to our Arnold render view, okay, let's go from here and we'll hit play. We can see that that is actually still fully opaque. Okay, and if we go to window, I want to make sure 3D manipulation is checked. Now with my holding down the Alt key, I can affect that. Right, so right now it's still fully opaque. So what we need to do to fix that is with the object selected, go into the shape node, then go under the Arnold tab and click to make that opaque. So now you'll see that it's updated, and now we're able to see through it to some degree. So you just got to remember that one little switch right here, uncheck opaque under the shape node. I don't know why they set that little trap for you, but there it is. Another note I'd like to make is, as long as you have the Arnold render view window up, you're not going to see updates in your Hypershade. Only one of these renderers is going to work at a time. Okay, so the only way to, if we turn that off, of course that's still going. Look, we'll take that off now. See that red line has disappeared, and now we can make updates in this window. But you can only have one Arnold renderer running at any given time. It's a licensing thing, I'm sure. One more note. I always want to make these notes because, I learned from these kind of tutorials myself, and I know you can easily get stuck. It's not at all unlikely that if you tried to render, that it just came up black, right? Well, remember, your Arnold renderer is always going to require lights to make the render. And so I did include just a sky dome light, and that's why it's showing up. Okay, so if you didn't put a sky dome light in your scene, you won't see anything but black. Okay, and if you do add any other lights, remember that in Arnold there's a fall off that doesn't exist in Maya. So you sometimes have to turn up the intensity of your light, not just by like 2 or 3, but by like 500 times before you start to see that light's effect. So just a quick note in case you're trying to follow along and it's black. Okay, when you use the Arnold render view, put a light in. The easiest thing is just stick a sky dome light in. If you put any other light in, just make sure to turn up its intensity until you start to see something. Just a reminder. Another thing I'd like to say is there are a lot of settings for shaders, and that can be kind of overwhelming. We're not always creating assets in Maya that are meant to be, rendered and animated and carried through in Maya. Quite often we're making assets or models that can be used in other applications like game engines, right? Like Unity or Unreal. And it can feel like, wow, there's a lot of settings to put in those materials. How does that translate over? And if you're creating materials here and you'd like to get those into other applications, right? Those game engines. Usually you can do it with 4 textures, right? That are kind of the most popular. And obviously the first one is going to be color, right? Your diffuse color. And then another one is going to be diffuse roughness, another one metalness, and the other one is probably a bump or normal map. If you have textures that modulate those 4 attributes, you could pretty much get it to look pretty similar both here and there by using those 4 attributes. You know, there are a million attributes that you can bring across and a million magical things you can do, but I'm just trying to simplify it, that those are kind of the 4 basics to the modern physically based rendering paradigm. So those are some important asides, but the main point or the main takeaway on this video is just that Arnold has its own dedicated shaders, right? Here they are. These are the main shaders. You can use these shaders the same way you would like these from Maya, okay? And there's mostly cross compatibility, right? Like you can even see here that the transparency was even showing up with the renderer 2.0, right? Before we even unlocked it in the geometry node, right? So that the Arnold renderer would respect the transparency. So there is cross compatibility. Every now and then you will find a shader kind of turning up black or something and not rendering the way you want. But for the most part, Arnold will render the Maya shaders, and Maya will render really most of the Arnold shaders.